Close your eyes. Imagine a palace. Not the white marble you might picture from paintings and films. The ancient world was full of color, deep reds and burning golds, carved stone wands smoothed by centuries of hands, oil lamps throwing warm, unsteady light across walls decorated with painted gods and heroes. This is Pella, the capital of Macedonia, somewhere in the northern reaches of ancient Greece, in a kingdom that the great cities of Athens and Corinth looked down on as rough, half-barbaric, and unworthy of serious attention. They would change their minds about that soon enough. Tonight we are here for a woman, not for the man whose name fills every history book, not Alexander, not yet. Tonight we are here for the person who made Alexander possible, who shaped him, protected him, believed in him when no one else did, and who fought with a ferocity that frightened even the generals who had conquered the known world. Her name, the name history remembers her by, was Olympias. Although that was not the name she was born with, it was not even the second name she used, or the third. She collected names the way other women collected jewels, each one marking a transformation, a new chapter, a new identity forged in the fires of a life that was never quiet for a single moment. She was a princess, a queen, a mother, a murderer, a mystic, a warrior, a schemer, and a survivor. She held her own against two of the most formidable men in history, Philip II of Macedonia and his son Alexander the Great. No small thing at all. Dan Carlin, whose extraordinary exploration of this story inspired this telling, put it simply: Philip II of Macedonia and his son Alexander the Great are two of the most impressive figures in history. Few could contend with either man. One woman held her own with both of them. Tonight, that woman's story. So settle in. Let the oil lamp flicker. Let the Mediterranean wind come through the window. And let the ancient world carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. The world she was born into. To understand Olympias, you need to understand the world she came from. She was born around 375 BC. Give or take a few years, the ancient sources are not precise on this point, in the kingdom of Epirus. Epirus occupied what is now the northwestern corner of Greece, a rugged, mountainous region of forests and rivers and coastline, home to a collection of tribes of which the most important were the Molossians. The Molossians were not Athenians. They were not the kind of sophisticated, urban Greeks who wrote philosophy and built the Parthenon. They were a harder people, closer to the land, more comfortable with violence, maintaining traditions and practices that the polished cities of the South had long since moved beyond. But they had something the Athenians could not claim. They traced their ancestry directly to Achilles, the great hero of the Trojan War, the greatest warrior who ever lived in the Greek imagination. The Molossian royal family claimed descent from Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, and they wore that ancestry like armor. Olympias was born into this family. Her father was Neoptolemus I, king of the Molossians. She was the eldest daughter, the princess, and from her earliest years she would have understood that her life was a political asset, that her marriage would be used to cement alliances, to bind kingdoms together, to serve the interests of men who would never think to ask what she wanted. She also grew up steeped in religion. The Molossians were intensely religious people, and the religious practices of Epirus were wilder, more ecstatic, more physically intense than anything the sophisticated Athenians engaged in. The cults of Dionysus, the god of wine, of ecstasy, of the dissolution of the boundaries between the human and the divine, were particularly powerful in this region, and Olympias was drawn to them from an early age. This matters. This is not a peripheral detail about a strange and exotic practice. The religious devotion of Olympias, her absolute conviction that she moved in a world charged with divine power, that the gods were real and present and accessible, shaped everything she did and everything she was. She was not pretending. She was not performing. She believed. Part 2 for Ambience. Her birth name was Polyxena. It is a name from Homer's Iliad, the name of a princess of Troy, beautiful and tragic, sacrificed on the tomb of Achilles after the city's fall. For a family that claimed descent from Achilles himself, the name was a statement of identity and of lineage. But Polyxena would not keep that name. The first change came with a religious initiation. Sometime in her youth, she took the name Myrtle. The myrtle was a plant sacred to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The name suggests initiation into one of the mystery cults that were such a central part of the religious life of the ancient Mediterranean. Ceremonies of transformation, of death and rebirth, of secret knowledge passed between initiates. It was as Myrtle that she traveled to the island of Samothrace. Samothrace was a small island in the northern Aegean Sea, home to the sanctuary of the great gods, one of the most important religious sites in the ancient Greek world. People came from across the Mediterranean to be initiated into its mysteries. The specific content of those mysteries was, by definition, secret. The initiates swore not to reveal them, and so we do not know precisely what happened there. What we know is that a young princess from Epirus arrived on Samothrace for initiation, and that a king from Macedonia arrived at the same time. His name was Philip. He was perhaps 23 years old. He had only recently seized the throne of Macedonia through a combination of military brilliance and ruthless political maneuvering. He had ambitions that would eventually reshape the entire Greek world. According to Plutarch, the Greek historian who is our most important source for many of these events, writing centuries later, Philip and Myrtle fell in love on Samothrace, that they were drawn together in the charged atmosphere of religious initiation, that something passed between them that went beyond political calculation. Whether that is romance or retrospective embellishment is impossible to say. Ancient historians had a weakness for a good story. What happened next was a marriage. In 357 BC, Myrtle, the princess of Epirus, became the wife of Philip II of Macedonia. She would receive her third name the following year. When Philip's horse won a race at the Olympic Games in 356 BC, his wife was renamed to honor the victory. She became Olympias, the name she would carry into history. And in the same year, The same extraordinary year of victories and omens, she gave birth to a son. She named him Alexander. Part 3. Philip of Macedonia. We cannot tell Olympia's story without spending time with the man she married. Philip II of Macedonia is one of the most remarkable figures in the ancient world, and one of the most underappreciated, because his extraordinary son cast such a long shadow that the father has been half forgotten. Philip was 23 when he became king in 359 BC, inheriting a kingdom that was in crisis. His older brother had been killed in battle against the Illyrians, along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers. The kingdom was surrounded by enemies. Its army was outclassed. Its treasury was depleted. Within a decade, Philip had transformed Macedonia into the dominant power in the Greek world. He did it through a combination of military genius, diplomatic brilliance, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. He reformed the Macedonian army, creating the famous phalanx, a formation of soldiers carrying enormously long spears called sarissas that proved devastatingly effective against anything the Greek world could field against it. He used marriage as a diplomatic tool with a pragmatic shamelessness that would have impressed a Renaissance prince. He married 7 times, possibly more, each marriage cementing an alliance, securing a frontier, binding a potential enemy. Olympias was his 4th wife, or possibly his 5th. The sources are not entirely consistent. She was the most prestigious of his wives because she brought with her the alliance with Epirus, and because she gave him his most impressive heir. But she was not his only wife, and in the world of the Macedonian court, that would become the source of everything. Philip was, by the accounts that survive, a physically impressive man scarred by decades of warfare, missing an eye from an arrow wound at the siege of Methone, moving with the slightly battered authority of someone who had been in the middle of the fighting, not watching from a distance. He was also, by those same accounts, a heavy drinker, a man of explosive rages that he sometimes deeply regretted, and someone whose personal relationships were complicated by the scale of his ambitions and the breadth of his appetites. He and Olympias, the sources suggest, were genuinely drawn to each other in the beginning. 2 intense, ambitious, passionate people meeting in the charged atmosphere of religious ceremony. But the marriage would not stay simple for long. Part 4. The Snakes. There is a story about Olympias that appears in multiple ancient sources, and that has fascinated historians and readers ever since. Philip, according to Plutarch, came to his wife's bedchamber one night and found her in bed with a large snake. This is not, in the ancient sources, presented as a shocking aberration. It is presented as entirely consistent with who Olympias was, a devoted member of the ecstatic cult of Dionysus, whose rituals in this region involved precisely this kind of practice. Olympias, it was said, was one of the most committed practitioners of the snake-handling traditions within the Dionysiac cult. She kept snakes. She incorporated them into religious rituals. She danced with them in the ceremonies that the ancient sources describe as terrifying to the men who witnessed them, wild, ecstatic, physically abandoned worship that crossed the line between the human and something else. Now, we need to approach these accounts carefully. The ancient sources were mostly men, mostly unsympathetic to Olympias, and mostly writing long after the events they describe. There is a long tradition in ancient historiography of associating powerful women with the irrational, the religious, the excessive, as a way of explaining and dismissing their power. Women who achieved what Olympias achieved must, the ancient male mind often reasoned, have done so through supernatural means, through magic, through the manipulation of forces that proper, rational men were too dignified to engage with. So we cannot simply take these accounts at face value. And yet, there is something consistent enough across enough sources that it seems likely that Olympias really was deeply committed to ecstatic religious practice, that she really did incorporate snakes into her devotions, that her faith was intense and physical and genuinely frightening to those who did not share it. The effect on Philip was significant. Plutarch writes that after the night of the snake, Philip stopped visiting Olympia's bedchamber, whether from distaste, from fear of supernatural contamination, or from simple discomfort with something he didn't understand. The physical intimacy of the marriage effectively ended. They had 2 children, Alexander, born in 356 BC, and a daughter named Cleopatra, born a year or 2 later. After that, Philip went elsewhere, and Olympias began the long, slow process of ensuring that her son, her extraordinary son, would inherit the kingdom that his father was building. Part 5. The Myth of the Divine Father. Here is where the story of Olympias and the story of Alexander become inseparable. Because Olympias, at some point, began to promote a story about her son's parentage. The story was this: Alexander's true father was not Philip of Macedonia. His true father was Zeus, the king of the gods, the lord of thunder, the most powerful figure in the Greek religious imagination. The mechanics of this claim were provided by the snake. Zeus, in Greek mythology, was strongly associated with snakes. He was often described as taking the form of a snake in his divine manifestations, and Olympias had been seen sleeping with a snake. The implication was obvious and clearly intentional. The night before Alexander was conceived, it was said, Olympias had dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb, kindling a great fire. Philip had dreamed of placing a seal shaped like a lion on his wife's womb, and the interpretation was that his son would have the nature of a lion. These are the kinds of dreams that ancient tradition assigned to the births of great men. Whether they were genuinely remembered, retrospectively constructed, or simply invented by admirers, we cannot know. But the divine paternity story, the claim that Alexander was the son of Zeus, not Philip, was one that Olympias actively promoted. When Alexander prepared to leave Macedonia for his great conquest of Persia, it was Olympias who took him aside and told him the truth, as she saw it, that his father was not Philip but a god. She was giving her son something invaluable: permission to be extraordinary. The psychological weight of being told by your mother with absolute conviction that you are literally the son of a god, that the divine blood of Zeus runs in your veins, that you are destined for something beyond what any merely human king has achieved is difficult to overstate. Alexander believed it, or he chose to believe it, or he performed the belief so convincingly and so consistently that the distinction between believing and performing became meaningless. He worshipped Heracles and Achilles, the great heroes of mythology who were also sons of gods, who had proved their divine inheritance through impossible deeds. He sought out the oracle of Ammon in the Egyptian desert, asking the god to confirm what his mother had told him. He received the answer he was looking for. Whether Olympias cynically manufactured the divine paternity myth to serve her political purposes, or genuinely believed in the divine nature of her son, or some combination of the two, the effect was the same. She gave Alexander the Great his sense of destiny. That is not a small thing. Part 6. The Court and its Dangers. The court at Pella, the Macedonian capital, was not a comfortable place. Philip had multiple wives, multiple children, multiple factions competing for influence, for the king's favor, for the position of primary heir, generals and nobles with their own interests and loyalties. A constant flow of ambassadors, hostages, and foreign dignitaries from the kingdoms Philip was steadily absorbing or intimidating into alliance. In this environment, Olympias was simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. She was powerful because she had given Philip his most impressive son. Alexander was brilliant. By the time he was a teenager, Aristotle had been engaged as his personal tutor, and even the greatest philosopher in the world found him a remarkable student. The boy Philip had called outstanding, at the age of 16, was clearly going to be a king worth following. Olympia's power rested entirely on Alexander's position as heir, which made that position something she would protect with absolute ruthlessness. Philip's other children were threats to be managed. There was Philip Eurydice, the son of another of Philip's wives, a woman named Philina. Eurydice was older than Alexander, which in the brutal succession politics of the Macedonian court made him potentially dangerous. According to Plutarch, Olympias poisoned him. Not to kill him, or if that was the intention, she misjudged the dose. But the result was that Eurydice suffered permanent brain damage. He became what the ancient sources call simple, mentally incapacitated in a way that removed him entirely from consideration as a potential heir to the throne. Whether Olympias really did this, we cannot know for certain. The ancient sources were not kind to her, and the accusation fits too neatly into the narrative of her as a ruthless schemer to be accepted without caution. But it is not impossible. The survival of her son required the elimination of his rivals. Olympias understood this with perfect clarity. And she was not a woman who hesitated when she understood what needed to be done. Part 7. The Marriage That Changed Everything. For years, Olympias managed her position at court with the skill and the vigilance of someone who knew that her security could evaporate at any moment. And then, in 337 BC, Philip did something that threatened to destroy everything she had built. He married again. His new wife was a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, not to be confused with the more famous Egyptian Cleopatra of later centuries. She was the niece of an influential Macedonian nobleman named Attalus, and she was, crucially, purely Macedonian by blood. This last point mattered enormously. Olympias was not Macedonian. She was Molossian, a foreigner, in the eyes of the Macedonian court. Alexander was therefore only half Macedonian. In a world where legitimacy was tied to blood and origin, this had always been a potential vulnerability. With a fully Macedonian wife producing a fully Macedonian heir, Alexander's claim to the succession became genuinely uncertain. The moment of crisis came at the wedding feast. Attalus, the uncle of the new bride, drunk and exultant, rose to make a toast. He called upon the Macedonians to pray that the gods would grant Philip and his new wife a legitimate heir to the kingdom. The implication was unmistakable. The word legitimate meant, as opposed to Alexander, as opposed to the half-foreign son of the Molossian witch. Alexander leapt to his feet. "What do you take me for, a bastard?" He threw his cup at Attalus. Philip, also drunk, drew his sword and charged at his own son. He tripped and fell. Alexander looked down at his father, the man who had conquered Greece, who was preparing to conquer Persia, lying on the floor of his own banqueting hall. "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia," Alexander said, "and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." He left the room. He took his mother and went into exile in Epirus to the court of Olympias' brother, where they waited. What was Olympias thinking in those weeks and months of exile? Her son's succession was under threat. Her position was more precarious than it had ever been. The marriage she had endured for 20 years, the political alliance she had maintained at such personal cost, the careful work of ensuring Alexander's path to the throne, all of it was now uncertain. She had her brother's court. She had her network of connections throughout Macedonia. She had almost certainly her own plans. And then Philip was murdered. Part 8. The assassination. In October 336 BC, Philip II of Macedonia attended the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra, the daughter he shared with Olympias, to Alexander I of Epirus, Olympias' own brother. It was a grand occasion, a celebration of a diplomatic alliance, a display of Macedonian power and Macedonian confidence. Philip walked into the theater at Aegae, the old Macedonian capital, between his son Alexander and his new son-in-law. He had sent his bodyguards ahead to demonstrate to the watching crowd that the king of Macedonia needed no protection. A man named Pausanias came out of the crowd and stabbed him. Philip II of Macedonia died in the theater at Aegae. His killer was cut down before he could be questioned, cut down, the sources note, by men very close to Alexander himself. Philip was dead, and Olympias and Alexander had returned to Macedonia for the wedding, and they were on the spot. The ancient sources are not subtle about the implications. Olympias was widely suspected of involvement in the assassination, or, at minimum, of having known about it and done nothing to prevent it. The circumstantial case is interesting. Pausanias had a personal grievance against Attalus, the man who had humiliated Alexander at the wedding feast. He had complained to Philip about this grievance and been ignored. There were, some sources say, horses waiting for him to escape, horses that he failed to reach before he was cut down. Who prepared those horses? Olympias, the ancient sources whisper. Olympias. Did she do it? Did she arrange or encourage or simply permit the death of the man she had been married to for 20 years? Historians argue about this still. The evidence is circumstantial. The ancient sources were not neutral observers. The accusation fits too conveniently into the story of Olympias as a monster. And yet she had motive. Enormous, pressing, existential motive. Philip's new wife was pregnant. If that child was a boy, Alexander's path to the throne was blocked. The clock was running on everything Olympias had spent her life building. What we know for certain is what happened next. Philip's new wife Cleopatra gave birth, and Olympias had both the mother and the infant killed. Some sources say Cleopatra was burned alive. Others say she was forced to hang herself. The baby, whether a boy or a girl, the sources disagree, was killed. Alexander was reportedly angry when he learned of this. He had not ordered it. But he did not punish his mother for it. And with that act of violence, Olympias secured her son's throne. Part 9. The King's Mother. With Alexander on the throne of Macedonia, Olympias found herself in a new and complicated position. She was the king's mother, the most prestigious woman in the kingdom. Her long struggle to put her son on the throne had succeeded. And Alexander was everything she had believed he would be. He was 20 years old when he became king. Within 2 years he had crushed a Greek rebellion, secured his northern frontiers, and crossed into Asia with an army of 35,000 men to conquer the Persian Empire. He never came home. For 13 years, Olympias and Alexander communicated by letter across thousands of miles, across the breadth of the world their civilization knew. She sent him advice. She sent him information about affairs in Macedonia and Greece. She lobbied on behalf of her friends and against her enemies. He listened to some of it. He ignored much of it. Their relationship was warm. By the standards of the ancient world, genuine affection runs through the accounts of their correspondence. But Alexander was careful to keep his mother away from actual political power. Macedonia was governed in his absence by a regent named Antipater, an experienced general and administrator who had served Philip II and whom Alexander trusted. Olympias hated Antipater. The feeling was mutual. She wrote Alexander letter after letter complaining about Antipater, his arrogance, his independence, the way he treated her as though she had no authority whatsoever in the kingdom her son was ruling. Alexander's response, on one occasion, was to say that his mother was charging a great deal for the 9 months she had carried him. It was a brutal thing to say, and it tells you something about the complexity of their bond, the genuine love coexisting with the recognition, on Alexander's part, that his mother's ambitions and his own political needs were not always aligned. He could not give her what she wanted, which was real power. Giving her real power would have meant humiliating Antipater, whose loyalty and competence he needed. So he held them both at arm's length and tried to manage the tension from a distance. It didn't really work. It couldn't work. Olympias was not a woman who accepted being managed. Part 10. The woman behind the legend. Let us pause here for a moment. Because Olympias is almost always seen through the lens of what she did rather than who she was. She is the murderer, the schemer, the snake-worshipping witch who used her son as a political weapon. But there is another way to look at her life. She was born into a world where women had no political power, no legal standing, no independent identity outside their relationship to a father, a husband, or a son. The only power available to her was the power she could accumulate through the relationships and the networks and the manipulations that the ancient sources condemn her for. She could not lead an army, not yet. She could not speak in the assembly. She could not negotiate treaties under her own name. She could not hold property in her own right. What she could do was position her son. And in doing that, in using every tool available to her, in refusing to accept the marginality that her world assigned to women by default, she did something that almost no woman in the ancient world managed to do. She shaped the course of history. The Alexander who became great, the Alexander who believed himself the son of Zeus, who sought to outdo Achilles, who wept at the tomb of Achilles and called him the most fortunate of men for having a friend like Patroclus and a poet like Homer to celebrate his deeds. That Alexander was, in large part, her creation. His sense of destiny came from her. His belief in his divine origin came from her. His mother's name for him, her absolute, unconditional belief that he was extraordinary, that the world owed him recognition of his greatness, had entered into his bones. The ancient sources condemned her for her methods. But the methods worked. Part 11. The Long Wait. While Alexander was conquering Persia, Egypt, Bactria, and India, Olympias waited. She waited in Macedonia, managing her relationship with Antipater with the barely contained hostility of two people who needed each other and despised each other simultaneously. She waited in Epirus sometimes, retreating to the court of her brother or his successors when the tension with Antipater became unbearable. She waited for letters, for news, for the dispatches that told her where her son was, what he had won, whether he was still alive. She worried about him constantly. Ancient sources preserve the flavor of her correspondence, anxious, opinionated, loving, sharp. She wanted to know everything. She had opinions about everything. She was simultaneously his greatest admirer and his most demanding critic. She also, during these years, continued to accumulate influence. Her networks in the Macedonian court, her relationships with Alexander's generals, her position as the king's mother, which gave her a prestige that Antipater could not entirely override. She managed the Oracle of Dodona, the great religious sanctuary in Epirus, one of the oldest in the Greek world. Her connection to religious authority, to the divine world that she had always moved in, remained a source of real power. and she continued to promote the idea of Alexander's divine origin. When Alexander visited the oracle of Ammon in the Egyptian desert and was hailed as the son of a god, Olympias was not surprised. She had known this, or at least claimed to have known this, for 30 years. She may have been the one who wrote to the oracle, preparing the ground, ensuring that the right answer was ready when Alexander arrived. Or she may simply have been the woman who had raised a boy who believed he was the son of Zeus, and watched as the world slowly came to agree with him. Part 12. Alexander dies. In June 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. The greatest military commander in the history of the world, who had never lost a battle, died not in combat but of a fever, almost certainly aggravated by years of excessive drinking, by the accumulated wounds of 2 decades of campaigning, by the sheer physical cost of what he had done to his body. The empire he had built, stretching from Greece to the borders of India, had no clear successor. He had produced no legitimate heir who was ready to rule. His wife Roxane was pregnant with his child, but the child had not yet been born. When his generals gathered around his deathbed and asked to whom he left his empire, he is reported to have said, "To the strongest," or perhaps to the best. The ancient sources are not consistent even on his last words. What followed was decades of civil war, the wars of the Diadochi, the Successors, as Alexander's generals carved up his empire between them, fighting over the pieces of the world's greatest conquest with a ferocity that would have dismayed even their dead king. Olympias was in Epirus when she heard the news. We have no record of her immediate response. No letter survives, no contemporary account of what she felt in that moment. What we know is what she did next. She prepared to fight. Part 13. The Wars of the Successors. Olympias was 60 years old when Alexander died. In the ancient world, 60 was old. The average life expectancy was considerably lower than today, and the physical demands of ancient life wore people down in ways we can barely imagine. But Olympias was not done. Alexander's death had left a vacuum, and into that vacuum she moved with the same ferocious energy she had always deployed in the service of her son. Now she deployed it in the service of her grandson. Roxane had given birth to a son, Alexander IV. He was the legitimate heir of Alexander the Great, the continuation of the royal bloodline, the person Olympias had decided the empire should belong to. The problem was that everyone else had decided something different. The generals of the Macedonian army, hard, experienced men who had conquered the world and who had no intention of being managed by the mother and the infant son of their dead king, were carving out their own kingdoms. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Mesopotamia, Antigonus in Asia Minor. In Macedonia itself, the struggle centered on the question of regency. Who would govern the kingdom in the name of the young Alexander IV? There was also the complication of Philip or Hideus, Alexander's mentally incapacitated half-brother, who had survived despite Olympia's apparent earlier attempt to neutralize him. He was still alive, still technically a potential king, and now he had a wife. Her name was Adea Eurydice, and she was, in her own way, every bit as formidable as Olympias. Part 14. Two Queens. Adea Eurydice was the granddaughter of Philip II through a different line. She was the child of Philip's daughter Cyne, who was herself a warrior who had fought in battles and trained her daughter in the same arts. Adea Eurydice had grown up fighting. She was trained in arms. She was young, fierce, and absolutely committed to the promotion of her husband's claim to the Macedonian throne. She was, in short, a worthy opponent for Olympias. The confrontation came in 317 BC. Olympias had returned to Macedonia from Epirus with an army, the army of the Epirot king Eurydice, who was her cousin and her ally. She came not as a suppliant or a negotiator. She came as a warrior, or at least as the political and symbolic force behind a military operation. Adea Eurydice met her with her own army. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary moments in ancient history. The two armies faced each other, and Adea Eurydice's soldiers refused to fight. They looked across the field at Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, the woman they had served under, the living embodiment of the greatest period in Macedonian history, and they put down their weapons. Some accounts say that Olympias was dressed in the robes of a priestess of Dionysus, that she came to the field not in armor but in her religious identity, the role she had always been most completely herself in, that the soldiers saw not an old woman with an army but a force of nature, a representative of the gods, the mother of the man who had made them conquerors of the world. Adea Eurydice was captured. Philip Eurydice was captured. Both were executed on Olympia's orders. Philip Eurydice was killed. Adea Eurydice was given the choice of how she wished to die, by rope, by sword, or by poison. She chose the rope. By some accounts, she died with extraordinary composure. Olympias gave Philip Eurydice no proper burial. She had her enemies dug up from their grave, the men who had opposed her over the years, the generals who had been loyal to Cassander, and scattered their bones. She was brutal, she was thorough, she had waited a long time. Part 15. Cassander. The man she had been fighting against during this entire period, the man whose allies she was killing, and whose power she was dismantling, was Cassander. Cassander was the son of Antipater, the regent whom Olympias had despised for so many years. He had inherited his father's position, his father's network, and something of his father's cold efficiency. He also hated Olympias with a personal intensity that went beyond political rivalry. Antipater, on his deathbed, had reportedly warned his son, "Never allow a woman to hold power." He was thinking specifically of Olympias. Cassander was coming. He besieged Olympias in the city of Pydna, cutting off her supplies, tightening the noose around the city over the long months of winter. The situation inside Pydna grew desperate. Food ran short. The elephants that Olympias had used in her campaign died of starvation. People inside the city starved. Olympias held out. She held out through the winter, waiting for the relief that never came. Aeacides, her Epirote ally, had been overthrown by his own people. They had no desire to keep fighting a war for Olympia's cause. The other potential allies failed to materialize. Eventually, in 316 BC, she was forced to surrender. Cassander had promised her safety. He did not keep that promise. He could not kill her himself. Killing the mother of Alexander the Great with his own hand was something even Cassander understood he could not do without serious consequences for his own legitimacy. So he brought forward the families of the people Olympias had killed during her brief period of power, the relatives of the men whose bones she had scattered, the connections of the men and women she had executed. He invited them to judge her. They stoned her to death. She was approximately 59 years old. Ancient accounts say she died without flinching, that she did not beg, that she arranged her robes as the stones came, maintaining her composure, dying as she had lived, with an absolute conviction of her own dignity and her own worth that nothing and no one had ever managed to take from her. Cassander refused to let her be buried. A few years later, he had her grandson Alexander IV and his mother Roxane quietly murdered. The line of Alexander the Great was extinguished. Part 16, the verdict. How do we judge Olympias? She was, by any measure, a woman who caused tremendous suffering. The murders she ordered of Philip's wife and child, of Philip Orhidius, of Adea Eurydice, of the many political enemies she had killed during her brief hold on power, cannot be minimized or explained away. She was ruthless in ways that shocked even the people of her own time, who were not easily shocked. And yet, she lived in a world that gave women no power except the power they seized. She used the tools available to her, religion, sexuality, maternal love, political manipulation, and ultimately violence, with a skill and a ferocity that no woman of her era matched. She shaped one of the greatest figures in human history. The Alexander who conquered the known world was, in ways both visible and invisible, the product of his mother's love and his mother's ambition, and his mother's absolute conviction that he was destined for something beyond what any ordinary man could achieve. She fought for her son. She fought for her grandson. She kept fighting when every rational calculation said the fight was over. She held her own against two of the most formidable men in history. And she died without surrendering. Dan Carlin, whose exploration of this story has inspired this telling, captures the essential truth of Olympias in his framing of her. Philip II and Alexander the Great are two of the most impressive figures in history. Few could contend with either man. One woman held her own with both of them. That is her epitaph. That is enough. Closing, the lamp goes out. And so the story of Olympias comes to rest. From the princess of Epirus who arrived on Samothrace as a teenager, to the old woman who arranged her robes as the stones began to fall. Polyxena, Meatael, Olympias Stratonis. 4 names, 4 lives inside one life. A journey that took her from the mountains of Epirus to the courts of the ancient world's greatest empire, through love and war and murder and grief, and the extraordinary privilege and the extraordinary burden of being the mother of Alexander the Great. Let the images settle now, like dust in the lamplight. The girl on Samothrace meeting a king. The young queen, her newborn son in her arms. The news of Philip's victory at Olympia arriving with the news of the birth. The woman taking her son aside before he crossed into Asia, telling him who his father really was. The letters crossing the miles between Macedonia and Babylon, mother and son who would never see each other again. The old woman standing before the army of Adea Eurydice, dressed as a priestess, watching the soldiers lower their weapons. The stones falling in the winter light. Let those images grow quiet. The lamp is burning low. The Mediterranean wind is still outside. There are no more battles to fight tonight. No thrones to claim, no sons to protect, no empires to contend for. Only the ancient dark. And sleep. Soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.